Welcome to the debate. Our source material today really presents a challenging paradox about modern consciousness. It argues quite strongly that stillness is not laziness, it's radical self-awareness. And, it sharply contrasts this with the idea that rushing is often a way to avoid the deeper truths within us. So the implication is that our constant motion, our sort of high-velocity lives, are maybe rooted more in psychological evasion than genuine purpose. So the central question we really need to address is, does the material accurately categorize all high-speed action, productivity rushing, as fundamentally rooted in this avoidance, this fear-based false self? Or, or can intentional dynamic action actually be a necessary and authentic path towards self-discovery? My position is that fundamentally, rushing is a psychological coping mechanism, and it's a kind of destructive cultural illusion that really has to be dismantled through stillness.
Okay, I see that. But I guess I come at it from a slightly different angle. While that critique of avoidance is powerful and it definitely resonates with, contemporary anxiety, I think the source maybe risks oversimplifying the complexity of action itself. Purposeful, high-speed motion, when it's correctly aligned, of course, can be, I believe, a valid catalyst for the very clarity and transformation the text actually demands. It doesn't have to be just fear-driven flight. We need to draw a clearer line, I think, between panicked movement and, let's say, courageous implementation.
Well, the strength of this material, for me, lies in how precisely it diagnoses this cultural illusion around speed. We're conditioned to equate speed with value, right? To think our worth is measured by the intensity of our output. And the text is pretty clear on the psychological function here. Rushing acts as a pervasive distraction. It stops us confronting those internal voices that, well, they only really surface in silence, the regrets, the fears, all that unprocessed pain. The goal, as it's laid out, is shedding the false self, which is described as an identity built entirely on fear and survival, becoming tragically addicted to productivity, approval, and motion. This identity is explicitly called just scaffolding, not a home. So the movement itself, the rushing, is the performance of fear. We have to, as the text says, stop confusing speed with meaning, productivity with self-worth, or motion with identity. Stillness has to come first, or we won't find the truth.
See, I want to push back a bit on that fundamental distinction you're drawing because it feels like it assumes a very linear progression. Stillness, then clarity, then action. But what about the implication within the material itself when it calls clarity the real danger, precisely because it demands change? If we reach this radical self-awareness and stillness, the awareness that results is often, frankly, unbearable unless it's coupled almost immediately with equally radical action. Think about that warning. Awareness without courage equals despair. If quiet time reveals, say, a life built on total compromise, a toxic job, a relationship that's draining you, the truly courageous, the authentic response isn't necessarily more quiet contemplation. It might actually be a dynamic, high-speed transition to a new reality, implementing a really difficult, life-altering change. Well, that often feels like an intense, high-velocity upheaval, a breakdown that is, in fact, the necessary breakthrough. And that kind of action, I'd argue, is driven by courage and alignment, not fear. And it demands tremendous, rapid motion. Even Laozi's idea that nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished, that implies purposeful, efficient velocity, not paralysis.
Okay. Let's dig into that first point then. Is productivity inherently part of this false self? I struggle with the timing you suggest. You're saying dynamic action can be the catalyst, but the text makes a pretty strong case that the self currently in charge, the one capable of organizing all that rapid, intense action, is fundamentally addicted, that the rush is defensive, a survival mechanism. Genuine, soul-level, embodied, unfiltered creation, as the text describes it, seems to only arise after that inner struggle with the false self has, well, settled down a bit. If we jump straight from painful awareness into rapid, high-intensity action, how can we be truly sure we haven't just, transferred that addiction to productivity onto a new, maybe seemingly more virtuous goal?
True creation, I think, comes from an internal compulsion to express, and it's not really concerned with external metrics or outcomes.
Addicted productivity, though, it's defined by needing external validation, approval, measurable success. Until we've sat in the silence long enough to really tell the difference between those two drivers, any speed seems suspect.
I absolutely agree that addicted productivity, chasing external validation, is corrosive. But the material also asks us to let go of who you were taught to be. Now, what if the authentic self, the one that's finally revealed when that scaffolding collapses, what if it is inherently high energy, dynamic, productive? I don't mean productive like filling a calendar just to feel validated, but productive in the sense of realizing huge creative visions or building something meaningful or affecting social change at scale. When someone finds their true calling, often that energy doesn't just manifest as quiet contemplation. It can look like a sudden overwhelming and yes, often rapid burst of creation that appears very high velocity to the outside world. So to just dismiss all dynamic creation as an addiction of the false self seems like it risks pathologizing a fundamental human drive toward, vigorous expression and making meaning. We shouldn't confuse the mode of action, its speed, with the motive behind it, which might be fear or might be something else entirely.
But the motive is still the tricky part, isn't it? That rush to create, even great things, can still be a rush away from just sitting with oneself. Think of the classic example, the successful novelist who churns out books at this impossible pace. Is that really authenticity? Or is it just a highly sophisticated way to avoid the emptiness that might creep in when the keyboard goes silent?
The text demands we stop performing survival. If the authentic self truly is dynamic and expressive as you suggest, then surely its expression would be purposeful, efficient, aligned, like Lao Tzu's nature, not driven by that desperate kind of speed needed to maintain a schedule or just distract the inner voices.
And that rush of transformation you describe, well, it often requires immense internal resources. If those resources haven't been properly replenished and organized through stillness, then that speed is just, frankly, unsustainable. It leads straight to burnout, which seems like the ultimate symptom of the false self collapsing under its own frantic pace.
That framework makes sense, but what worries me is this implication that we have to wait for some kind of internal perfection of the self before we dare to act dynamically. I mean, many profound internal shifts are actually triggered by external action. They often feed each other, don't they? If I'm genuinely trapped in a circumstance that is actively draining my soul, waiting for some sustained, profound period of stillness before making a massive, high-speed exit, well, that might just let the toxic environment erode my will and courage even further. The sheer force needed sometimes to dismantle old habits or geographical ties, moving continents, ending a 20-year career, that often requires an intense, focused period of high-velocity planning and execution. And that energy isn't necessarily born of fear. It can be born of necessity, driven by a newfound clarity that just demands immediate implementation. In that case, the velocity serves the clarity. It doesn't obscure it. Okay, let's loop back to that powerful metaphor the source uses. Storms don't just destroy, they reveal. While stillness might provide the initial spark of confrontation, the destructive phase, the really painful undoing of all the external structures not rooted in truth, that often is a stormy, high-velocity upheaval in someone's life. Think about that person in the soul-crushing job again. Stillness reveals how deep the compromise goes. Okay, but the immediate courageous action might be to resign, maybe move, maybe start something completely new, all actions demanding massive energy and rapid execution. This high-speed implementation breaks down the scaffolding of the old life much faster and arguably more effectively than just passively waiting for it to decay in prolonged silence. This chaotic but necessary destructive phase is the danger that saves you, as the text puts it. And its velocity is often just a function of how intense the required change actually is.
I absolutely see the power of the storm metaphor. Yes. But the material seems to heavily emphasize that the real war is internal. The process, it suggests, begins with the difficult, quiet work of mourning the life you're still living, recognizing all the ways you've numbed and compromised. This profound internal reckoning, well, it really needs to be done in the absence of external noise. If you immediately launch into a storm of moving, quitting, ending relationships, you run this huge risk of just substituting one form of external distraction for another, using the chaos of transformation itself to avoid the deeper, maybe more painful internal surrender that's required. That external change you're describing, I see it more as the consequence of the internal clarity achieved in silence, not the source of the clarity itself. The source seems pretty clear. Stillness is the teacher.
But does the teacher always just sit quietly? I mean, sometimes the lesson is learned right in the heat of the experience, isn't it? The very energy required for this radical, courageous change can itself be clarifying. When you're forced to make high-stakes, rapid decisions like, I don't know, liquidating assets or confronting someone with the painful truth, you discover pretty quickly where your true lines of integrity actually lie. The internal war, I think, is often won during the external storm, not just before it. My concern is that prioritizing an absolute stop to motion risks creating a new kind of avoidance, the avoidance of necessary conflict, of necessary dynamic engagement with the world. We could even become addicted to the idea of stillness, maybe using quiet reflection as an excuse to never actually summon the courage to implement the frightening changes that clarity demands.
You raise a critical point there about avoiding conflict. But the text seems clear that the hardest conflict is the internal one. If dynamic action truly facilitates that internal resolution, then why does the material link rushing so clearly, so consistently to the existential avoidance of the self? I think the societal pressure is what creates this confusion. The material specifically anchors this dynamic in our collective worship of speed, highlighting the constant connectivity, the glorification of being busy. This pervasive cultural backdrop makes rushing the easiest, most celebrated substitute for confronting those core existential questions, like, who are you without your achievements? When we actually stop moving, the existential weight of that question just becomes unavoidable. Stillness forces the confrontation that even high-stakes, seemingly purposeful motion might still allow us to mask.
That's a very compelling point about the societal pressure, definitely. But let's look at the potential human cost of insisting on mandatory stillness for everyone. Have you considered that a complete, maybe dogmatic cessation of motion might actually lead to paralysis rather than clarity for certain individuals? Maybe people whose neurochemistry or just their life circumstances really demand external engagement. You know, Nietzsche, who often comes up in these discussions, warned against those who couldn't sit still. But freedom isn't just conceptualized in the quiet. Freedom is often realized through dynamic, intentional action. For some people, perhaps the quickest route to truth is that trial by fire of dynamic engagement. They break the scaffolding by impact by taking a high-risk, high-speed leap into the unknown. Because maybe waiting for the slow decay of quiet contemplation just isn't a viable option, or it's structurally unhelpful for their particular temperament.
I do recognize that risk of paralysis, but I don't think the material is suggesting perpetual stillness. It seems to be suggesting stillness as the necessary precursor to genuinely authentic motion. The real problem is discerning whether that high-risk leap you describe is true courage or if it's just another attempt to manage anxiety through action. If the intent behind the leap is still fundamentally rooted in proving self-worth or achieving external success or maybe escaping unresolved trauma, then the velocity of that action is just, well, it's fear in a new coat, isn't it? Stillness provides the diagnostic tool needed to verify the true motive. Without that verification, the trial by fire might just be another dramatic performance by the false self seeking survival. We have to insist, I think, that clarity is primarily an internal experience of being, which is distinct from the external experience of doing.
But this insistence on a purely linear clarity feels like it ignores that clarity is often iterative. For that high-velocity individual you mentioned, maybe a period of dynamic action can actually reinforce stillness later. They move rapidly, they execute a change, and maybe the success, or even just the completion of that aligned action, grants them the peace and security needed to finally rest, to really rest. The authentic self, in that scenario, uses high speed not to avoid truth, but maybe to secure the ground upon which truth can eventually settle more deeply. If we define rushing only by its negative, avoidant connotation, we risk losing sight of the transformative power that can be inherent in decisive, energetic, and yes, rapid action. The intention behind it is everything, and maybe that intention can only be accurately observed by the individual listener reflecting on their own experience.
And the material, I believe, is giving the listener the primary tool for that observation, the temporary absence of external motion. So the core argument for me remains sound. The authentic life we seek is described as being quiet, waiting for you in the silence. Rushing obscures this fundamental truth by keeping our focus perpetually outward. The primary and probably most difficult transformation needed is that internal confrontation provided by stillness, which forces us to stop confusing external success and motion with real, soul-level aliveness. The path has to start with that internal reckoning.
Okay, look, we definitely agree that unexamined, purely fear-driven motion is harmful avoidance. No question there. However, I think we absolutely must introduce more nuance when we talk about implementation. Clarity demands both courage and change. And the actual process of implementing that difficult, life-altering change, the necessary breakthrough, is often inherently dynamic. It frequently requires the very purposeful, high-velocity action that the material, perhaps in its understandable effort to dismantle hustle culture, risks dismissing entirely as just rushing. Ultimately, the onus really falls on the listener, doesn't it, to do that challenging internal work of discerning between the aligned action of the true self and the fearful flight of the false self. There's clearly much more to explore in the psychology of navigating that critical transition.